Hey, Monica.
Hey, Jennifer.
Okay, Monica, catch me up on your chat with Katie Day from Surfrider. I've been so swamped lately. I hated missing this one, but you said it was absolutely amazing.
Yes, it really was. Honestly, once again, inspiring, hopeful. Katie shared a ton of tips on simple, meaningful actions we can take to help protect our oceans and coral reefs. Some background on Katie to start. So, she's the senior manager of science and policy at Surfrider, incredible organization focused on protecting and enjoying the world's oceans and beaches for everyone. And they've built an incredible network of activists, and they really work on tackling ocean issues from every possible angle, whether it's organizing beach cleanups, which kind of people hear about typically, for pushing for big policy changes, including like we talked about sunscreen.
I love that. And I've loved Surfrider and their mission for years. So I'm so excited about this conversation you're having with
Yeah,
Katie.
yeah, same here. So in our conversation, Katie and I dive into all things, that are threats to the ocean. Like I mentioned, sunscreen to plastic pollution, and why individual choices really do matter more than we think. We talk about why oceans matter, no matter where you live, and what we need to look out for as consumers and advocates for change.
Okay, so let's get to Monica's conversation with Katie Day.
Katie, welcome to Biophilic Solutions. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. I want to jump right in and talk about climate regulation and the ocean because that's what we know Surfrider is really cares about. And we'll talk more about Surfrider in your background. But I really want to just jump in and think about how people can be connected to the ocean, or it may seem an abstract, distant concept if we're a little more landlocked, like here in Atlanta. But why do you think it's important to restore a really community focused reciprocal relationship between us humans and the ocean? Talk a little bit about that for us.
Sure. Yeah, great question. So, like you flagged, the ocean does provide, it makes the earth habitable to humans and to life as we know it. It covers the vast majority of our planet, and it has absorbed, 90% of the excess heat that we have contributed to cause in our atmosphere. It also has absorbed, 30% of the excess carbon dioxide that's been emitted. So it's really helping to minimize the impacts of climate change, but that can only last for so long. I think people all over the United States are more connected physically to the ocean than they may realize. So, first of all, 40% of the US population lives in coastal counties. But for all the folks that live inland may feel like that they're really distant, like you flagged. But in fact, our surface waterways, so, rivers, streams, even some of our groundwater, ultimately, for the most part, make their way back to the ocean. And the biggest example of that is the Mississippi River Delta. The Mississippi River Delta's basin encompasses 41% of the nation's contiguous landmass.
And when you're speaking about the Mississippi Delta, you're talking about all the side, like because it's like that seems like a crazy amount of landmass, but it goes across the whole country, right?
Right. It's the drainage basin. So that
Okay.
means that any pollutants or, even surface waterways can ultimately feed their way back into the Mississippi River, which then releases into the Gulf of Mexico,
Hmm.
the ocean. So, I mean, that's 31 states that are either partly or entirely within the Mississippi River Basin. And that's because our rivers are connected, right? The Tennessee River connects into the Mississippi River. From the West Coast, there's elements that connect to the Mississippi River, all the way up from Montana, North and South Dakota, even parts of Utah and New Mexico, and then up and over to parts of New York and Pennsylvania. That it all be interconnected and make its way into the Mississippi River and into the Gulf. So even if you feel like you're physically really far away, your actions and the environment is more connected than you may realize.
Yeah, no, and I think even these like few statistics you've already dropped on us, like are kind of opening my eyes. Like I thought I understood, but I think, we don't really understand how much the ocean is absorbing and kind of taking the hit for us, environmentally. They've been doing heavy lift, right? But to your point, they can't do it forever because at some point they're going to reach a tipping point. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think awareness is really important, right? And then the connection, getting people into the ocean or understanding it. I love the waterways example, but like, where are we on sort of our tipping point? I know, the science is there. and we don't 100% know, but you start hearing about the oceans are heating up and there's just junk being poured into them, especially from agriculture.
Yeah, from agriculture, fertilizers, but even
Mhm.
from sewage makes its way
Ugh.
into the ocean. And then, of course, chemicals of all different types
Mhm.
make its way into the ocean. And for the longest time, right, there was this notion of dilution is the solution to pollution. Oh, it's okay if it gets into the ocean. It's so big, it's not going to cause a problem. Well, that's not the case anymore. I mean, so much mercury has made its way into the ocean from human development and industry that when you're pregnant, so any of our listeners that have ever been pregnant, at least in the United States, have probably been told by their doctor not to consume fish or not to consume certain fish like tuna that
Oh, the
have,
big the
high levels, exactly higher up on the trophic level, not to consume those fish because of dangerous levels of mercury that can cause birth defects for the baby that you're growing. It's there's so many examples of that where, our ocean is getting more polluted than it's able to handle. It's
Mhm.
also experiencing something called ocean acidification, where there's so much carbon dioxide being emitted into our atmosphere. But again, our systems are connected. So that surface layer of the ocean actually undergoes a chemical reaction with the air above it. When the ocean starts absorbing that carbon dioxide, the good
Mm.
news for us, right, is it's pulling it out of the atmosphere. The bad news for the ocean is that it's making the ocean more acidic, which is making it less hospitable for, marine life. And we're seeing, really severe repercussions for especially shellfish, animals that rely on that ability to that rely on carbonate. And so like
Mhm.
the shells of oysters and clams. So that's a big concern for shellfish and aquaculture industry, and that's their
Mhm.
livelihood. So when it comes to when it comes to a specific threshold, I don't have like a number or a one single estimate for you, but there's so many different ways that we're seeing the ocean being saturated with pollutants and
Right.
with, major impacts that we can't just assume that it's fine because the ocean is
Mhm.
so big.
Yeah, no, and it's you're making it very relatable, and I really that's wonderful. Like it's so scientists, I think, or professors, like we have a lot on, and they're just so great at communicating the information and showing examples. And so I'm just gonna like repeat it because in my head this is helpful for me. You can hear something, right? We hear ocean acidification. I don't know what that is, and then I'm not sure what it like, "Oh, it sounds bad." And so much of it, back to the, like, it feels out there or I can't quite grasp it, and so even the fact that you're like, "Okay, well, why does it have more acid?" Okay, it's the carbon dioxide. This is great. It's getting pulled out of the atmosphere, but then you're like, "It's less hospitable." Well, how? And then, the shellfish, the carbonate, like, their little shells are just not gonna be formed, and I've heard a little bit about that where the clams, and so now we have all these fisheries, right? People who this is their living on anything that has a shell, a mollusk, that they're not doing well. And so there's this ripple effect. But sometimes we have to bring it down to the human level, the personal level. I always say, or not always say, but I've said, and it's sort of sad that, the majority of people, when we're like, hey, don't put, you know, chemicals down your sink because the fish are going to die. And everybody's like, what? It just has no, but if I start to say, hey, we shouldn't, you just had a baby. We want our house to be healthier. So let's change up the things that we're using on cleaning or dish soap or in our dishwasher. And let's find safer alternatives that are going to be healthy for the family, right? For your newborn. And then the benefit is the fish, it's downstream, it's better. But it is such an interesting thing, right? And I don't want to say that as a humanity we're selfish, but that we're protecting ourselves and our family first, right? Which is total human nature, right?
I think there's just this historically, a lack of awareness of
Mhm.
how we impact the environment, but then how that ultimately is impacting us again, right? If we
Mhm.
are poisoning the water, and that can poison the fish, and then we're therefore poisoning ourselves by consuming that fish. So it's that interconnectedness is really important to remember from what we're eating, what we're drinking, what we're inhaling. When we release things into the environment, they don't just cease to exist. They
Yeah.
now exist there, and we are exposing ourselves back to it.
But that's another challenge, right? It's like everything we do, even if like here at Serenbe, I'm recycling, I'm doing glass, I'm doing the other recycling, I'm doing compost, where I'm separating everything. But then it just goes away. And I know where the compost goes because we compost on site. But we do have a tendency, at least in Western society, to just be like, out of sight, out of mind, it's gone. The next thing I want to talk to you about, that sort of continues into what not to be on a negative, but the harm we're doing to the oceans is I want to talk about plastic pollution because I think, we have been told, right, consumers, it's our problem. You need to sort, you need to recycle, which I'm 100% for. I'm happy to do it. We do it, but it really is. And the Surfrider may not have an opinion. I don't want to push you guys into it, but I know you do advocacy in DC. You're sort of like, well, what about the manufacturer? Like, how can they start to use less plastic? And you do see some, plant based plasticky things. It's more recycled, but there's so much in this recycling world where we're not even sure if it's happening anymore. I guess I've got two questions for you. One, you know, uh, what's going on sort of in DC? Is there policy? Are you guys have the ability to help push policies and changes? And let's forget about the current administration who seems very against it. But in general, I think government regulation would be really important and then corporate oversight, right? I do think those are really important when it comes to environment. And I know everybody's like, let everybody be alone. They can figure it out. The market will figure it out. But the market's not figuring it out. So my question is sort of, I don't know if people really understand the extent of the harm that's caused by it. And then, so like, tell me, is there any kind of movement? Where do you guys see how you can push that awareness? And then let's talk a little bit about the hidden impacts in the ocean and with plastic. So it's a little bit of a duel.
Sure. So, in regards to like, are there opportunities to help prevent or mitigate the impacts of plastic from a policy angle? Absolutely. So, at Surfrider, for the most part, most of our action happens in local communities. And that's where we've been able to help support hundreds of various bans on easily avoidable, unnecessary single use plastic items, right? These are things that you're getting in your to go food, plastic forks, plastic ketchup packets. Maybe you're getting 20 ketchup packets and you're going to use one. Those are things that you're taking it home and then they either live in a drawer forever or you just throw them away. So it's just plastic that you're not even using is one clear example. We call that skip the stuff. And we've
Mm,
been able to pass dozens of bans on skip the stuff in local
great.
communities across the United States. Also, easy swap outs, banning the use of single use plastic bags and encouraging people to have reusable bags, banning single use plastic bottles in certain areas. There's so many different items that we've had policies help prevent the continued use and exposure of those where they ultimately end up in the ocean, in the environment, or in a questionably functioning recycling system.
Hmm.
Um, at the state level, we've also, thanks to that, grassroots movement of all those local bands showing that this is possible, it's doable. We have businesses on board, we have communities on board. People are supportive and the world is still functioning because even though we've banned this one item, it's not like everything is crumbling. It's proof of concept that then we've been able to have states follow suit and states working on single use plastic bans and modeling better state legislation. California passed a really impressive bill several years ago to try to address plastic pollution and even set targets of single use plastic reduction
Mm,
in the state. And then at the federal level, there has been some really, really wonderful legislation introduced over the past several years in Congress. For example, a really impressive, huge one was the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act that Surfrider was honored to have been involved in from the very get-go, where we, introduced the original sponsors saying, hey, you're interested in plastics, and kind of highlighted major issues that then inspired them to draft this really impressive comprehensive bill that included, single-use plastic reductions, elements of what we call extended producer responsibility. So putting some of
mm,
that burden back on the manufacturers, right? we're always taught that if plastic waste from products that we purchase is our problem. And there is some element of that, right? Like
Of
we
course.
chose to buy that plastic
Yep.
item as opposed to refilling or finding an alternative source for that. But manufacturers also have responsibility to bear. So there's this increasing push for EPR, extended producer responsibility,
Mhm.
for manufacturers to either have send back programs where if you
Mm.
use their waste, you can send it back to them and they'll make sure that it gets recycled or gets
Right.
used.
Right.
So, from Surfrider's perspective, the best mechanism for reducing plastic pollution and all of the impacts associated with it is reducing first.
Mhm.
Avoid the use of single use plastics as a key one as much as you can. And we're not saying that you have to be perfect because one perfect person, right? I don't use any plastic at all in my life. That's amazing. That's a great proof of concept that you're able to do that. That's not what we're striving for. We're not striving for perfection. We're striving that one perfect person. We're striving to have thousands or millions of people just be a little bit more mindful. Just cut out a little bit more plastic because that's where you're seeing that big economies of scale, that way bigger impact is having a bunch of people do one little thing versus one perfect person. So that's where we're focusing, right? Like, let's make progress where we can. Let's not overwhelm ourselves into inaction. And that's a big problem that we're seeing in regards to climate change, in regards to ocean impacts, in regards to plastics. Let's focus on things that we can do and can have
Right.
a major and real impact on.
Well, and that's pretty exciting, that legislation, the Breakthrough Plastic Solutions Act. And that's the kind of thing that we love to highlight that stuff on the show because we want to give people hope. Everything is so doom and gloom. And it's like there are good things happening, whether you're happy with government or not today, like this did go through. And then uh oh,
Did get introduced during
okay.
multiple congressional sessions. It did get a ton of supporters in Congress, and it did bring a ton of awareness about the issues of plastic pollution and opportunities for addressing it. But it did not become law.
Okay. Okay. So that's still an opportunity.
Well, it hasn't been reintroduced this session,
Right.
but there have been we call breakaway bills from that big.
Okay. That's great.
So, yeah, there's a bill that's been reintroduced that would help ban styrofoam, which is called expanded polystyrene, which
Which would
is,
be amazing.
yes, that stuff is like essentially not recyclable and
Yeah.
a lot of health concerns, especially if you're microwaving it or using it to store your
Yeah.
food items. Those chemicals in the plastics can leach into the food that then you're consuming. And there's been all sorts of studies of seeing elevated levels of various chemicals that are plastic additives found in bloodstream and in various organs from those who consume a lot of food in various plastics.
Yeah, I always see, some of my favorite places to buy groceries, well, that'll be like steam in the bag or, microwave it in the plastic, da da da. I mean, almost 100%. I'm buying it for the convenience, but then I'm taking it out of there and putting it in my own like glass dish, whether that works or not. But
Smart.
I'm like, we shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah. I mean, I have
Anyway,
seen some lawsuits about, again, just because I have a baby, it's on my mind, but like, plastic baby bottles that you're then purposely heating up with the milk inside.
right.
Been some lawsuits being like, hey, this is leaching chemicals, this is leaching microplastics.
Ugh.
We're being specifically advised to use your product to do this. So, I think there is, again, that awareness is building.
Well, yeah, I've heard the same thing about, plastic bottles that like, anytime, you try not to, right, have them at all or, purchase them at all. But, I've heard that like they're on the truck, right? And so it's not a refrigerated truck, the like generic plastic bottle that they're actually heating up and leaching into I'm like, okay. People like don't leave a plastic bottle in your car because it's all going to leach out from the heat. So tell me a little bit about, as we're talking about long-term impacts with plastics, let's bring it back to the marine ecosystem. And then we can talk about how that affects human health as well. But talk to us about plastics in the oceans.
Yeah. So a lot of our plastic waste, a lot of our trash in general, ultimately makes its way into the ocean and into the environment. Sadly, a lot of that's just from mismanagement. of the trash and we send it off, to the curb. Again, it doesn't cease to exist. It has to go somewhere. There was that fallacy of recycling that was really elevated several years ago when several, Southeast Asian countries said, we're no longer going to take US
Yes,
recycling because it's
right.
not getting recycled. It's not being sorted appropriately. And it's
Mhm.
ultimately just going into the ocean there. So we're not only are we like kicking it down the road, but sometimes we're just burdening other communities and countries with the waste that then again is just ultimately getting into the ocean. Now, there are some places that do have robust recycling infrastructure, and recycling is an important part of the solution. But that's where avoiding the use of plastic is kind of the most important thing when you can. Again, don't
Yes.
stress, you have to live your lives.
We're not perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, but do what you can. Make those swaps where affordable, where available. When it comes again to the ocean impact. So sadly, the benefits of plastic, right, is that sure it's cheap, but also it's long lasting, right? It's really durable
Mhm.
in its use phase. But sadly, that durability remains in its end of life as well. So that
Mhm.
plastic, sticks around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, especially if it's buried, right? Then it's preserved in a
Mhm.
landfill. But when it gets into the ocean environment, it can, especially like seafood or fishing industry, like those large scale nets that become ghost gear, right? That maybe get cut off or that just get dropped into the ocean.
Mhm.
That can cause really lasting, decades long impacts to marine life that get entangled in those nets and
Mhm.
ultimately suffocate, drown, or starve to
Ugh.
death. A lot of our plastic debris can cause those issues of animals getting entangled, getting unable, reducing their ability to breathe, to forage, to mate,
Mhm.
resulting in fatality, which is so sad and a lot of suffering. And then that's like the macroplastics. But then in the environment, plastics break down in a way that
Mhm.
they don't like return to their natural elements. They break down into smaller and smaller fragments and ultimately becoming microplastics or nanoplastics, which you've likely heard about.
Yes.
These are really concerning because they're so small and easily to be transported that essentially everywhere researchers have looked, they've found microplastics. So in the ocean, they've found them in coral polyps. They found them in fish. They found them in the actual, muscle of fish that they were then consuming. There's all sorts of statistics on the amount of microplastics that humans are consuming every day, be it from fish consumption, but also in salt. They found it in our water. They found it in our air. So we're
Ugh.
inhaling them, we're drinking microplastics or eating microplastics. They found it in human bodies, right? They found it in blood serum. They found it in organs. They've also found that it's able to become so tiny and lightweight that it can get into the atmosphere and in the higher levels of our atmosphere and be transported around our planet. So they have found microplastics in even the most far reaching, considered pristine environments because there's like no human development nearby. It's undergoing atmospheric deposition. So microplastics
Ugh.
are actually falling back down from the atmosphere onto the land. So yeah, they're a big problem and a big concern. And what are the impacts of that? And that's what they're still trying to understand.
Mhm.
What are the impacts of this microplastic exposure? There's some studies are identifying potential neurotoxicity,
Ugh.
fertility issues, hormone issues. So lots of research happening there. The good news is there's awareness of the problem and there's
Mhm.
research undergoing to try to better understand. And again, we have to live our lives. We can't just like panic and, you don't
Yeah.
want to like just completely shut down. This is unfortunate reality of the choices that we as humanity have made and the industry is doing, but maybe let this information fuel us to pivot, fuel us to not create and expand plastic production facilities,
Mhm.
fuel us to not opt for plastic materials.
Right.
So I am kind of going bigger than the ocean, but the ocean is definitely a key area where a lot
No,
of waste and debris make its
I
way.
think that's fantastic. And I'm curious, like, I know when I had my kids ages ago, that really sparked a lot of changes in our household, right? From the food we were consuming, that we were then having them consume, to the household products we were putting in the house, to what clothing we were putting on them. And obviously, each generation of new moms will have a different issue or maybe new awareness. Are you hearing from your peers that they are more concerned? Because I think when I had my kids, like it wasn't even quite awareness that in the umbilical cord they were finding, all of these chemicals, like a baby, which is supposed to be the purest of the pure, right? And even if you're being the best mom you can try to do, like, so with that knowledge, are you hearing more from moms, like the changes that they're making? Like, I just wonder if like the groundswell is coming from a younger generation because there's more awareness versus like moms in their 50s who maybe we were doing organic food and we were changing up our household, surface sprays or something. But this is, there's just new information coming every day. So I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
looking for the hopeful sunshine.
I think there's definitely an awareness and a desire to cut out plastics and, harmful chemicals as much as you can for sure. And there's silicone bags that are available that people
Hmm.
use instead of the single-use plastic bags. There's a bunch of, silicone or glass baby bottles that people definitely seem to be opting for because of that awareness of potential exposure. Now, if you have to use a plastic baby bottle, you have to use a plastic baby bottle.
Exactly.
Some
Yeah.
day some daycares still require that, and you kinda have to, like, do what you can to protect your baby, but also not don't judge yourself, don't
No,
judge others, that's always that balance, right? If you're trying to be as good as you can, as perfect as you can for this, like, sweet
no,
little
it's
thing, but
impossible. Yeah.
yeah, we just have to live within the confines of reality. But that said, like, do I find that with my peers and others with, young babies, this awareness and desire to limit and reduce plastic exposure? Absolutely.
That's
Yes.
great. Yeah, that's really great. Well, and the other thing on a hopeful note, and we've interviewed some of the companies that are doing this, taking fishing nets, or I hadn't heard the term ghost plastics, but that's such a great, or ghost gear, and obviously Patagonia would be sort of maybe put them up on a pedestal, amazing. But there's so many cool people doing great work with that. Is that something also that you're pushing as a Surfrider, or just really on the local level?
Yeah, so our predominant focus at Surfrider is on those single-use plastics, like from foodware. That
Hmm.
said, Surfrider hosts thousands and thousands of beach cleanups in communities across the nation, and some areas where are just major, huge fishing gear nets and ghost gear nets come up on shore. So in Hawaii, for example, our chapters are way more involved in
Hmm.
trying to prevent ghost gear and in removing those major fishing nets from the environment, from the coast to prevent that further damage and entanglement. But it is great, but we definitely, even if we're not organizationally leading the charge on ghost gear, there are amazing organizations that
That's great.
and it's good to kind of, work collaboratively and together, but we can't all do everything. So we kind of,
No.
focus on our various issues, but then collaborate and encourage and support each other.
Well, let's talk about sunscreen because that's another thing that's a big deal. We recently, my kids had a spring break sort of at a beach resort, and the resort itself requested that you have, I think it was reef safe sunscreen. But, so many ingredients in conventional sunscreen really are going to wreak havoc on the oceans, marine life, but really the coral reefs as well. Talk a little bit about what people should know about these chemicals and like how can we make safer choices?
Absolutely. So, another threat, like you flagged, is chemicals and pollution that makes way to the reef. And recently, over the past decade or so, there's been this awareness about sunscreen chemicals. And I think it's good to back up for a minute and just clarify that sunscreens, one, are very important. We need to protect our skin from UV radiation, and they're a great tool in the toolbox to do that. But there are different types of sunscreen, and the two main types are physical blockers. So,
Hmm.
this is your minerals of zinc oxide and titanium dioxide that go on your skin, remain on the surface of your skin, and physically block your skin. They are a physical barrier between your skin
Hmm.
and the UV radiation. Then there are chemical sunscreens, and this is what we kind of consider conventional sunscreens. These are designed to be absorbed by the outer layer of your skin, and they essentially trap that UV radiation and dissipate it as heat before it can cause any damage to your skin. So they both protect your skin. They're both effective at preventing burns and preventing damage to your skin and your cells, but the way they do it is very different. When these chemicals that are approved for use in over the
Hmm.
counter sunscreens first came out,
Hmm.
90s when they were first approved, there wasn't a ton of research done on them and it wasn't considered to be, an issue.
Mhm.
What they've found is that these chemicals are actually quite toxic to marine life, right? They're
Mm.
able to come off your skin. If you read the label, it'll say, like, if you're playing in the ocean, reapply every 20
Yeah.
minutes. That's
Yeah.
because it literally wipes off your skin. So some of it gets absorbed by your body, and then the rest of it gets wiped off while you're recreating, especially if you're like agitating it, right? You're surfing, or you're
Mhm.
swimming around, you're snorkeling. So you keep reapplying, reapplying. Well, now that's more and more getting into the ocean.
Mhm.
And certain areas that are, especially in, like, big tourism areas on the coast, you'll see this like oil sheen on the surface of the water, and that's actually chemical sunscreens that
Oh,
have come off because a lot
wow.
of it floats. It's hydrophobic. So there's this kind of awakening and reckoning of like, okay, we're slathering this stuff on by like huge amounts, and then it's leaching off of us into the ocean. One estimate is that 14,000 tons of sunscreen enters our ocean every year, um, globally. So it's getting in there. Then what they're seeing is that it is toxic to marine life and contribute to coral bleaching. So coral reefs are a living organism. A lot of times they look like rocks. A lot of people don't realize that they're, alive. Um, and they're made up of these little coral polyps. And those polyps have this symbiotic relationship with an algae called zooxanthellae. And zooxanthellae, they basically undergo photosynthesis, and they basically provide polyps with nutrients. So like they're this like almost like a food source. They provide food for our coral polyps.
Mhm.
Well, what they found is certain chemical sunscreen ingredients, oxybenzone, octinoxate being key examples, octocrylene, avobenzone as well, is it's damaging that zooxanthellae and causing the polyp to expel that zooxanthellae. It kicks it out.
Hmm.
Polyps are kind of starving themselves of those important nutrients from that.
Wow.
And when they expel the zooxanthellae, that's what causes, or what we call, coral bleaching. So now, instead of having all of this beautiful color, they start to look stark white because of
Mm.
the algae that gives corals their different beautiful colors.
Mhm.
So now they're kind of starved of nutrients. They've also found that oxybenzone can um, impact like the actual DNA and cells of coral polyps.
Ugh.
It can reduce their ability to procreate. It can create what's been known as zombie reefs, where they even look healthy, but they're actually essentially dead.
Mm.
It's highly toxic to coral reefs, but they've also found that it's toxic in getting ingested by other marine life as well. So they've found oxybenzone in dolphins. They've found them in sea urchins. They've found them in so many different marine life. So it's not just the reef, but it's also all of these animals around the area. When it comes to humans, they've also found that these chemical sunscreens, a lot of the ingredients of chemical sunscreens, are
Mhm.
getting absorbed into the deeper layers of our skin, more than they realized when the FDA first approved their use in what's called the generally recognized as safe and effective list. So, FDA several years ago even came out making an official recommendation to remove all active chemical sunscreen ingredients from their list of generally recognized as safe and effective due to concerns about potential adverse human health impacts,
Okay.
claiming that there is a lack of research and supporting evidence that these chemicals are safe for use on humans. Another little interesting tidbit is, back in the day, sunscreen was like pretty much always SPF 30, sun protection factor 30. And that prevents like 97% of UV radiation. Then we started kind of seeing that number climb, right? SPF 50 is really common.
Yeah.
That protects against 98% of UV radiation. Well, then you start seeing SPF 80, SPF 100, SPF 120. And that incremental increase in UV, like SPF 30 already blocks 97%.
Right.
And sometimes, depending on your own personal risk, talk to your doctor about sun exposure. You may be one of those people that really need to have like absolutely no UV. In that, I would recommend covering up as opposed to doing sunscreen. But um, you know, so no hard feelings if you need to use that level. But in order to reach those really high levels of SPFs, they
Mhm.
need to add more and more chemicals into that product. So now you're getting more oxybenzone, more avobenzone. You're not getting more of the individual. Then you might also get several chemicals as opposed to it just containing one active chemical as a UV blocker. It might contain 5 or 8 of the UV blockers all in the active ingredients label. So to meet that higher level of protection, you're getting more chemicals and more of them added to your skin, getting in your body, and then ultimately getting into the environment. So that was another big decision making of what went into the FDA recommending removing those chemicals. The efforts on that have essentially been paused indefinitely. A lot of that was from
Okay.
cosmetic industry pushback, but
Uh,
their findings still stand are and still important to be aware of, that it's, not just impacts and toxicity concerns for the environment and our coral reefs, but also for human health questions as well.
yeah, it's crazy. And I've seen some that have the chemical and the mineral
Mhm.
stating that it's the best of both worlds and you need this to get the better protection. But it's really, really interesting to understand the differences. And I don't think I quite knew the difference. I knew the chemicals were bad, but I didn't understand how it worked. I mean, and the technology, right? Probably everybody was really excited that this was a new technology. We're so used to like I remember as a kid growing up in California, your lifeguard with the blue, the white zinc oxide nose. So many of, I think so many of the mineral ones have the technology's gotten better. So it isn't a white sheen all over you, right?
You don't have to do like a thick white paste. When I grew up surfing, and I'm from the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, so I have a long, very direct and immediate, history with coral reefs and interface with coral reefs. But when we'd go surf, like we call them zinc masks. We would just like glob on the full, like
Yeah.
full white face
Yeah.
of thick because it stays on and it
Yeah.
provides the best protection. It stays on
Yep.
much
And
longer than
you're
sunscreen.
in the ocean, that reflectiveness, having also grown up in the ocean, like you just, it's
Oh yeah, it magnifies. So
a
you
lot.
definitely get
Yeah.
sunburn. So like we say, sunscreen is important to use, but let's be a little bit more mindful of what
Hmm.
type of sunscreen we're using. The good news is zinc oxide is broad spectrum, so it prevents against both UVA and UVB
Hmm.
rays. You always want to make sure that you're opting for sunscreens that are considered broad spectrum, that are able to defend against both. SPF only measures the amount of the protection value, I think, for UVB, but you want to be against both. So
Okay.
don't just look for the SPF number. Make sure it literally says broad spectrum
Broad
on it.
spectrum. Yeah. And again, you see that and I'm like, I didn't really know I kind of knew what it meant, but
And it's helpful. So, like UVB, think of it more as the burn. That's the
huh.
redness.
Okay.
UVA is the aging. That's like that wrinkles. So, you definitely want to
Want
protect
both.
both.
Yeah. That's huge. So, Katie, tell me a little bit about as we wrap up coral reefs, like why is the health of them so important?
Coral reefs are considered the world's most biodiverse ecosystem. So that means 1 square foot, there are more different types of plants and animals than anywhere else on the planet. Additionally, they cover just 1% of the ocean, but they support 25% of all marine life. So coral reefs are critical for supporting
Hmm.
wildlife in the ocean. They are, they provide habitat for millions of animals. They're an important feeding ground, nursery. But then when it comes to humans as well, they help protect the shoreline and help keep sand on the beach. Waves are
Hmm.
able to dissipate 97% of wave energy. So when a wave crashes before it hits the shore, so instead of just coming up and pulling all that sand off the beach, taking it back to the ocean, reefs can help protect and keep that sand present.
Yeah.
When it comes to fisheries, coral reefs, again, if they're supporting 25% of all marine life, a lot of fisheries are reliant on a healthy coral reef, as well as, the impact. If they're not catching reef fish, there's that food chain impact where those reef fish
Hmm.
eat the bigger fish, which are the one with maybe what they're catching further offshore. So again, they're all interconnected. Reefs can also, they're an amazing place to go snorkel and see. They provide a ton of recreation and tourism benefits. And that's where it can, it was really upsetting for me. I grew up as a first mate and a snorkel guide, taking people snorkeling and going to explore the coral reefs. That's still one of my
Yeah.
favorite things ever, is having someone like put a mask on and take a look below the ocean surface for the first
Amazing.
time ever, and seeing this whole world, this like thriving, beautiful environment with all these colors and fish, and yeah, seeing that look on their face, and they just, you have no clue what lies below the surface sometimes.
Yeah. The awe. Yeah.
And really taking that, looking in and taking a peek is just incredible. So much marine life there. So it was so upsetting when I found out that I myself was slathering on that sunscreen, all the time, every day,
Yeah.
thereby impacting negatively this environment that I'm in awe of and intentionally going to like talk about and explore and bring others to. So, it was definitely upsetting. And that's where I think like we need to be easy on ourselves, but we also just need to use this as a learning opportunity to then, maybe do better. Fortunately, there are alternatives. So we can use more reef friendly or more reef safe
Right.
sunscreen options, being those non nano mineral sunscreens. I do want to highlight that we do say recommend non-nano because the larger size zinc, the micro size zinc, just stays on a little bit better, and they don't have any toxicity concerns. The nano, smaller sized zinc and titanium dioxide are just a little bit easier to rub off, so they just get in the marine environment a little easier.
Okay.
Um, and they haven't really been found to cause cell damage and get, permeate deep into the layers of our
Hmm.
skin like chemical sunscreens, but kind of just recommended to opt for that non-nano size so that you can, feel really confident that you're safe and you're protecting the marine life while you're
Right.
creating. And then, sunscreen isn't the only option. I always tell people we want to use sun management. And that's a mix of, covering up, using, UPF clothing or rash guards and hats when you're out in the sun, and then still using sunscreen on the exposed part. So it's again
Hmm.
a tool in the toolbox. When possible, you can avoid those peak hours of sun exposure, which are generally from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Yeah, so it's not, sunscreen is not your only option, but it's definitely a great tool to help protect yourself.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I'm like going to go and look at what all the stuff that I use because I was very specific when I traveled and I got like a certain brand for the kids and all of us when we went to this resort. But I'm like, I put sunscreen in my face every day. I have to go in and look and see which kind it is.
And it's not just when you're snorkeling and when you're on vacation, right?
Mhm.
So, like we said, our waterways are interconnected even inland. And
Mhm.
you're using chemical based sunscreens even at like the lake or just in the morning. And
Or
then you
just washing it off at night.
take a shower and that washes down the drain. A lot of these chemicals aren't getting filtered out at wastewater treatment plants. So they
Mm.
are also making their way into the waterways and ultimately potentially making their way into the ocean. They've also found that it's not just marine life that can be
Mhm.
impacted. Aquatic freshwater species have also been found to be negatively impacted and have like toxic effects from exposure to certain chemical sunscreen ingredients. Even though we call it reef safe, we focus on coral reefs. It's so much more than that. A lot of other wildlife, aquatic species, as well as oceanic.
Yeah. Ugh. Okay. So where are we on promising things that are happening? Because it starts with awareness, right? And then we need to know sort of like who can we support? Obviously going to beach cleanups, like, lending your time and treasure. But like talk about anything that we haven't talked about, promising shifts that are happening or what's missing. Like what would you in Surfrider like to see going forward?
So, promising things that are happening are like the awareness, right? I
Hmm.
mean, awareness from sunscreens, reef-friendly sunscreens, to single-use plastics like straws, right? So many folks like had this great awareness of switching from plastic straws to paper or more compostable or reusable. Another great example of progress that's been made is
Hmm.
several years ago or several plus now, Surfrider, along with a group of wonderful individuals and
Hmm.
organizations, helped pass the first ever ban on notably harmful chemical sunscreen ingredients, oxybenzone and octinoxate, in Hawaii.
Okay, great.
And
Wow.
that ban brought a ton of awareness about the issue of harmful chemical sunscreens and about the availability and option for more of those reef friendly, that zinc and titanium dioxide might be a little bit safer
Hmm.
for us and the environment. And that caused this surge in production of more reef friendly sunscreen. So it was partly driven by that policy shift because now
Yeah.
if you want to sell your sunscreen in Hawaii, it cannot contain those two chemicals. And that was a huge signal to sunscreen producers. The other thing was that helped build awareness of the general public. Now, our own purchasing decisions by the public have shifted, and people
Hmm.
are purposely, intentionally trying to buy more reef friendly sunscreens, which is another signal to producers, right? We have purchasing power and we can really help signal what supply we want to see based on our demand, right? So by the public showing up strong and just making their everyday, personal decision making on what
Hmm.
products they want to buy, that can help build that importance and that drive for producers to make more of the products that we want to see. So there has been, again, that surge in production of reef friendly sunscreens. The problem is the term reef friendly and reef safe are not regulated.
I was going to ask, yeah.
What we do see from a handful of manufacturers are, is that reef friendly sunscreen stated on the label of your sunscreen, but it actually contains chemicals that are known to be toxic to marine life and to coral reefs.
Mm.
And that's where you said, you've even seen some mineral sunscreens have chemical sunscreens also listed. So the onus is on us as individuals and as purchasers to actually look at the back of that sunscreen and read the ingredients label. The good news is all sunscreens are required to show their ingredients right on
Okay.
the packaging in the United States. So we have the tools, we have the power, we can literally just turn that thing around and read the active ingredients section to see if any chemicals are listed. There's a long list of long, hard to say chemicals, but the easiest thing to say is, you only want to see zinc oxide and or titanium dioxide listed in the active. If anything else is listed, then it's likely a chemical and then it is not reef safe and not reef friendly. So don't trust those terms. Actually look at the ingredients label to make sure that it's minerals in the active ingredients.
Is there anything where, like, the environmental working group is really looking at like health, it seems like? And so their tags might say, well, this sunscreen has a low number, a green number.
Mhm.
But are they looking at, or is anybody looking at environmental problem, like environmental health? Like, it's like one thing, is like the health, if I'm putting on my skin, is it healthy? If I'm putting in my body, is it healthy? But there's nobody that's sort of doing a, to your point, the reef friendly, the reef safe isn't regulated. I mean, EWG, I guess, isn't, they're self regulated. They've created their own system of
Yeah,
study.
EWG has that great database to
Hmm.
check on your products and look at human health
Yeah.
issues. I do think they do highlight a little bit of environmental impacts as well. Dr. Craig Downs,
Okay.
he's an ecotoxicologist, he's been at the forefront of highlighting these issues. We've worked together multiple times on passing bans on harmful chemical sunscreens in certain communities, including here in the US Virgin Islands. We have a ban on the sale and use of
Right.
harmful chemicals that contain octinoxate, octocrylene, and oxybenzone. He has a lab called the Hereticus Laboratory, and I believe they have like a certification that
Okay.
they assess sunscreens for or of other products for.
Great.
I don't really know of many others, but I do think that we're focusing just on the general public education, so that
Which is
we're not
great.
reliant on other certs, right? Because that can just be another thing that manufacturers have to pay to get
Another
for.
loop. Exactly.
And the nice thing about this surge in reef-friendly sunscreen is we're seeing a lot of like smaller businesses, right, pop up. So it's not just like big, massive industry, that are owned by like the large corporations, but there's a ton of, smaller companies. Maybe there's some locally owned companies that are making reef-friendly sunscreen. So it's great to be able to support them. And as the technology's gotten better, like you flagged, they're at the same price point as conventional sunscreens. For a
Mm.
while, like the nice mineral sunscreens were pretty expensive, and that's problematic, right? That's cost prohibitive. But the good news is now you can find mineral sunscreens at pretty much anywhere where you are. They can be at the same price point as conventional sunscreens, which is
Yeah.
really important.
Well, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask, sort of a final question about like what can people do, right? Again, we sort of started out talking about maybe we're disconnected from our environment, from nature, from the ocean. And so the first thing is, education, but we get overwhelmed by all this information. Like, where do we start? What meaningful actions that maybe aren't the usual advice, like what would you recommend we think about with the ocean? We've talked about sunscreens, we talked about plastics.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, the ocean coral reefs, for example,
Mhm.
are kind of an example of like death by a thousand cuts, right? There's so many stressors. There's chemicals, there's climate change, there's ocean
Mhm.
acidification, there's physical damage from boats that are like throwing their anchors overboard without looking below before they throw, right? And causing
Right,
physical damage of the reef, or snorkelers standing on the reef, not realizing it's alive. And that just by touching the reef, you could harm that coral polyp.
right.
There's also from the shore sedimentation, so from coastal development that washes off dirt and some sediment that comes off into the ocean and smothers those reefs. Sewage that can be released from wastewater treatment plants that's either undertreated or it wasn't fully, that wasn't treated before it made its way to the water. These are all, problems. These are all stressors to the reef and to the ocean environment. But those ones that are more locally specific, right,
Mhm,
like that sedimentation from coastal development, the chemicals from, snork from your sunscreen,
mhm.
the physical damage from boats, those are all opportunities that we can directly and immediately have an impact on, right? Just by
Mhm.
changing our own personal decision making and maybe becoming a little bit more vocal in our communities. So, we can easily right away remove that stressor of chemical sunscreen from the coral reef, which then is going to make it be a little bit more resilient and healthier and able to tolerate those major global long-term stressors that are a bit harder to
Right,
mitigate and to fix. Climate change, yes, we need to be reducing our emissions. And ocean acidification, but we can't really do that right now. But what we can right now is opt to not expose that reef to physical damage and not expose that reef to chemicals just by our own personal actions. So
I
if I'm
know.
snorkeling and I see someone snorkeling and they're standing on the reef, I'll go up and just politely be like, "Oh, hey, how's your snorkel going? Just a heads up, this reef is actually alive and you can cause damage just by standing on it." And almost every time their response is, "Oh my gosh, I had no
No
clue."
idea.
Yeah, it's not no
Yeah.
one's trying to, like, cause
No.
damage. It's just a lack of awareness and realization. So, being willing to, like, educate yourself and then talk about it and spread that awareness with others is really powerful. Making those own personal decision making so that you can, yeah, just those little impacts can go a big way, can make a big impact. Sorry, those little decisions can make a big impact in the long term, both from you and from spreading the word. Our actions have an impact and our voice matters and people will listen to you. People will also follow in your footsteps. So if you, make that effort to just be a little bit more thoughtful about your purchasing decision and talk to people about it, they'll follow you, and that's where you see that larger long-term benefits and impacts.
Yeah. Well, and the ocean's such a special place. It's like we want to protect it. So I appreciate all of your sharing, your education. It's been amazing. Where can we follow you or Surfrider will put in the notes? But do you do a lot of social media or blogs? I know you do some writing. Where can we follow you to keep up?
Yeah, I frequently contribute to Surfrider's coastal blog. If you go to Surfrider's website, surfrider.org, and we also have our reef-friendly sunscreen guide to kind of help
Perfect.
summarize the value of coral reefs and how to help you make your decisions on which sunscreens to use.
Great. I'm
And then
going there right now.
there's also on surfrider.org's website, there's our action alerts or our take action.
Okay.
And
Great.
that's a great way for everyone to kind of, especially for our national, federal policy efforts, it's a great way to have your voice heard for ocean protection. There's been so much progress in this awareness of the negative impacts of pollution on our reef and the negative impacts of offshore oil drilling, right? And the unavoidable oil spills that will eventually happen from new offshore oil drilling. Yet, even despite this awareness, federal government, our current administration, and members of Congress right now are trying to introduce legislation and pass legislation that would mandate the sale of new offshore oil drilling in our ocean. I mean, the budget reconciliation bill, not to get like super policy wonky really
No,
quickly,
it's important.
I think many people have seen that push of not selling off our public lands, right? The original draft had, or that passed the House, and that was a version that went through the Senate included a sell off of 3.3 million acres of public lands for development to try to offset this huge price tag that the bill is estimated to raise the budget deficit by. In addition to that, which hasn't gotten as much attention, is a sell-off of our ocean in the through offshore oil and gas leases of 80 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's just in year one. So the bill would mandate the sale of offshore oil and gas leases on 80 million acres every single year for 15 years. That's 1.2 billion acres in our ocean that would be mandated to be sold off to oil and gas industry. In addition to that, it includes a mandate of the sale of 6 million acres in Alaska's Cook Inlet. So there's a ton of marine life. There's so many organisms and dolphins and whales and sea turtles that exist in the Gulf. A lot of people think of the Gulf as a dead zone or a sacrifice zone. And sure, there
Mhm.
are areas that do have some hypoxia issues close to the river.
Mhm.
But outside of that, I mean, Gulf is beautiful and vibrant. There's so much life there. And
Mhm.
this bill, these provisions would literally it would sell off the entire western and central Gulf of Mexico planning areas to do offshore oil drilling, which is horrific. And it sets a dangerous precedent of now Congress mandating new drilling in
Yeah,
order
that's
to
the
make
crazy
money.
part. Mandating
Requiring, regardless of interest from industry,
need or
will
interest from
will
industry.
require it to require the federal government to sell off these oil and gas leases. And then
Well,
that
and that's
could happen, even if it's just in the Gulf right now, it's setting a precedent that this could happen to a coast near you. Maybe one
yeah.
day they decide to do the same thing in the Atlantic or at the Pacific Northwest. So even if you're not feeling like you're directly impacted by a sale of offshore oil and gas in the Gulf, if you don't live in a Gulf state, it's something that you should definitely oppose.
The people that I mean, in Atlanta, like everybody vacations down on the Gulf Coast. I mean,
There you go.
everybody. So you would think even like a quote unquote red state like Georgia or Florida or Alabama, which are directly impacted by, or Louisiana, you don't hear about that. It goes back to what we originally talked about, that the ocean is sort of like a little bit out of we don't quite versus land, which
Mhm.
obviously that selling off the lands I have heard about, but I haven't heard about the ocean.
Well,
So that's
and
great that you're bringing that to our attention.
And the good news is with that land sell off, there was such a robust public outcry that then got their Congress members who had originally been supportive of that provision
Mhm.
change their mind and listen to their constituents and say, you know what, you're right. I don't support this. And that provision got removed from the
Did
bill
it?
the other day.
Okay.
Yeah, yesterday,
But
2 days
not
ago,
but not the ocean one.
but not the ocean. The ocean's still there because there hasn't been a big enough outcry. So now
Okay.
we're definitely trying to sound the alarm to
Yeah.
get folks to speak up about this provision as well. There is an action alert on Surfrider's website. There's a
Okay,
blog
great.
on Surfrider's website that people can take action to
We'll
contact
link
their
directly to
members.
that. That's super important because, you know, nature without we are nature. Without nature, we are nothing, and we will have nothing, and we will have no ecosystem to support ourselves. And I'm just so pleased to have met you today, Katie, and have your time to share all this great information. So, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me and for giving a platform to raise awareness about these issues and giving I just hope that people don't feel overwhelmed, don't feel frozen, but I hope you feel inspired and feel like your personal actions can make a difference.
Yeah.
And even if that's just opting for a different sunscreen, that is helping the ocean. That's helping the coral reef. So know that
Yeah.
you're making a difference even in your everyday purchasing
Yep.
decisions. But
I'm empowered.
if you choose to also add your name and call your Congress member,
Yeah.
even better.
Yeah, even better. Love it. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Monica.
Monica, I love listening to that conversation. What really stood out to me right away was this idea that individual action does make a difference. I liked how Katie framed it, not as a matter of being perfect, but as an issue of scale. Okay, so sure, maybe I can't eliminate all plastic from my life, but if I make a few changes and then my friends make a few changes, that ripple effect really adds up. It actually does make an impact.
Exactly. And so early in the conversation, she said, let's not overwhelm ourselves into inaction. And again, I really appreciated that comment. The worst thing we can do is throw up our hands and say, well, nothing, nothing I do matters anyway. And so then we stop. And so she also mentioned later, oceans and climate issues are a death by a thousand cuts. So it's a tough truth, but it also means we can start healing things one small step at a time. So we need to take action right now to make sure the oceans are more resilient to climate change.
Absolutely. I mean, the sunscreen thing alone is a no brainer. Just look for zinc oxide or titanium dioxide. If there's anything else in the ingredients, it's probably not that great for the environment.
Yeah, and I, now realize maybe the reef safe or mineral sometimes doesn't actually fully tell the story. So check the ingredient list. We've got links in the show notes to both the reef friendly sunscreen guide that's actually reef friendly and Herdicus Labs. So definitely check both of those out.
Yes, and our producer Katrina was telling us she Googled the reef friendly sunscreen, and the first thing that popped up was full of harmful chemical ingredients. So we really can't emphasize it enough. Always, always read the label.
And one quick note, we recorded this conversation before the budget reconciliation bill, aka the big beautiful bill, was officially passed. And I know that you might feel discouraged for some of our listeners. It's definitely a tough one for me. But like Katie said, let's use it as fuel to keep showing up and to keep advocating for our oceans, no matter what coast you're on.
Absolutely.
All right. Talk soon, Jen.
Bye, Monica.